They had prepared themselves for hunger, for cold wind, and for wooden floors that never truly warmed. What they were not prepared for was the sudden wave of heat that met them the moment the barack door closed behind them. For a brief second, several of the men exchanged uneasy glances, as if something was wrong with the air itself. The room was warm, steadily and unmistakably warm, and that warmth felt less like comfort and more like a quiet trick. Had they misunderstood where they were, or was this unexpected comfort hiding something they had not yet discovered? The building stood near the edge of the camp, its windows slightly fogged from the temperature inside. Outside, the wind moved across the open ground without obstruction, carrying fine dust and the dry scent of wood and soil. The men had grown used to that wind during roll call and work details, and they expected the same chill to follow them everywhere. Instead, when they stepped into this particular structure, the air felt different, almost heavy with warmth. At first, they assumed it was temporary, perhaps the lingering heat from a stove that would soon fade. Yet as they removed their caps and adjusted their worn jackets, the warmth remained steady and deliberate. It was not the accidental comfort of sunlight through glass, but something controlled and maintained. The floorboards did not bite with cold, and their breath no longer formed pale clouds in front of their faces. One of the guards gestured calmly toward the center of the room, where several simple metal fixtures were mounted along a wall. Pipes ran neatly across the ceiling, disappearing behind wooden beams. The arrangement seemed orderly and permanent, not improvised. The men studied the space with quiet caution, trying to understand its purpose without asking questions they were unsure they should voice. They had been raised with certain expectations about indoor spaces during winter. In their experience, warmth was limited, often reserved for short periods or specific rooms. Fuel was scarce, and comfort was measured carefully. Here, however, the temperature felt constant, as if it required no sacrifice. That detail unsettled them more than the heat itself. As minutes passed, they began to notice another difference. The air carried moisture, faint but unmistakable. It was not the dampness of rain slipping through cracks, nor the condensation of too many bodies in a small room. It felt intentional, controlled. Some of the men shifted uneasily, unsure whether this environment signaled routine or something unfamiliar they had not yet encountered. Along one side of the wall, there were partitions, simple but solid, offering privacy in a way that surprised them. The design suggested that this was not a storage shed or workshop, but a place meant for repeated, organized use. The pipes above connected to valves that could be turned with ease, each marked clearly. The realization began slowly. This was not merely a heated building. It was a bathing facility designed for comfort, not just necessity. Warm water, delivered indoors, available in steady supply. For men who had known rationed heating and limited fuel, the idea felt almost excessive. Some approached the fixtures with visible hesitation, studying the metal handles and the drains beneath them. They expected the water, if it came at all, to be brief and cold. Instead, when the valve was turned, a stream flowed immediately, carrying visible steam that curled upward toward the beams. The reaction was not loud or dramatic. It was quieter than that. A tightening of brows, a brief pause, a glance exchanged between two men who seemed unsure whether to trust what they were seeing. The water did not sputter or fade. It continued steadily, maintaining its warmth without interruption. For a moment, suspicion lingered. Was this a demonstration, or something that would be withdrawn just as quickly? Yet the guard stood back calmly, showing no sign that the warmth was temporary or conditional. The facility operated as if it had always functioned this way. As the men adjusted to the idea, another thought surfaced, one that carried a deeper weight. Comfort, especially in captivity, could feel disorienting. They had prepared themselves mentally for hardship, believing that endurance required constant resistance to discomfort. Instead, They were confronted with a system that offered stability and predictability. The pipes hummed softly overhead, a steady rhythm that reinforced the permanence of the setup. The warmth did not fluctuate. It held firm, surrounding them without urgency. Outside, the wind continued its restless movement across the camp, but within these walls, the air remained calm. Some of the men finally removed their jackets, folding them carefully along the benches. The gesture was cautious, almost reluctant. Accepting warmth felt like stepping into unfamiliar territory. It challenged the expectations they had carried with them across an ocean. As steam gathered lightly near the ceiling, the space began to feel less like a surprise and more like a quiet revelation. The facility was not elaborate or luxurious. It was practical and clean, built with intention. Yet its consistency spoke of something larger, a system that functioned daily, not occasionally. The first chapter of their adjustment had begun not with hardship, but with heat. And that simple, steady warmth forced them to reconsider what they believed captivity would look like in this distant place. The discovery of warm water indoors did not settle into their minds all at once. Even after the first cautious use, many of the men remained alert, half expecting the supply to stop without warning. In their experience, comfort often came with conditions or limits. Here, however, the warmth returned each day with the same quiet reliability. They began to notice patterns. The building opened at regular hours. The pipes carried the same steady flow. There was no sense of improvisation or urgency. It operated as part of a routine, as ordinary as meals or roll call. That normality unsettled them more than any shortage would have. Some spoke softly among themselves while waiting their turn. They compared it to what they had known before the war. In certain cities, hot baths required preparation, time, and careful management of fuel. In rural areas, they were rare and brief. Yet here, in a fenced camp far from home, warm water arrived without visible effort. The floors remained dry and well-maintained. Drainage worked efficiently, and the steam never grew overwhelming. The space was designed for repeated use, not for show. It was not an exhibition of luxury, but an organized system built into daily life. A few of the younger men adjusted more quickly. They stepped beneath the flow with less hesitation, allowing the heat to ease stiff shoulders and sore backs from work details. Others moved slower, studying the controls each time, as if expecting them to behave differently. There was also a psychological shift taking place. The warmth softened more than just cold skin. It interrupted the rigid image they had formed about what captivity in America would mean. Many had imagined crude shelters and strict deprivation. Instead, they encountered structures that functioned with consistency. This did not erase the reality of confinement. The fences remained visible through the windows. The guards continued their patrols. Yet the contrast between restriction and regulated comfort created a tension that was difficult to define. Some began to wonder about the broader system behind these walls. If heated bathing facilities were standard, what else operated quietly and efficiently? What assumptions had they carried that might not match what they were now experiencing? The building itself offered clues. The plumbing was solid, the materials durable. This was not temporary construction. It suggested planning and investment. Even in wartime, resources had been allocated to maintain this level of infrastructure. Conversations shifted from suspicion to analysis. They speculated about fuel sources and water heating systems. A few with technical backgrounds examined the pipes and valves with professional curiosity. They recognized that the design required organization and supply chains functioning beyond the camp. Gradually, hesitation gave way to routine. Jackets were removed without pause. Towels were hung neatly. The steam became familiar rather than surprising. What had once felt extraordinary began to integrate into the rhythm of their days. Still, an undercurrent of disbelief lingered. Comfort did not align easily with their expectations of enemy territory. They had prepared mentally for severity, not structure. Accepting the warmth required adjusting their understanding of the place itself. Outside, winter continued its slow progression. Frost gathered along the fences in the early mornings. Work details carried the usual strain. Yet the knowledge that warmth waited at certain hours changed the texture of those cold days. The facility became more than a practical space. It served as a reminder that not every assumption they held would remain intact. The steady flow of heated water represented something systematic, not accidental. It was part of a broader framework they were only beginning to perceive. By the end of the second week, the building no longer felt foreign. It felt expected, and that expectation marked a quiet transformation. What once triggered suspicion now formed part of a predictable routine. The men did not celebrate it openly. There were no dramatic gestures or loud reactions. Instead, there was a gradual acceptance, expressed through smaller details. Shorter pauses before turning the valve, fewer exchanged glances, less guarded expressions. The warmth had not changed their status. It had not altered the fences or the fact of captivity, but it had introduced a layer of complexity to their understanding of their situation. The system around them was more organized, more stable than many had imagined. And with that realization came a new question. If this was ordinary, what other parts of daily life here might challenge what they believed they knew? By the third week, the building no longer drew a crowd of hesitant observers. The steam that once felt unfamiliar had become part of the camp's routine atmosphere. Yet something deeper was shifting beneath the surface, something less visible than pipes and valves. The men began to notice how the schedule shaped their days. Work details ended at consistent hours. Meals followed a predictable rhythm. Access to facilities, including the warm showers, fit into an organized pattern that rarely changed without notice. This consistency carried a quiet psychological weight. In earlier months of the war, unpredictability had defined much of their experience. Sudden movements, abrupt shortages, and shifting orders had shaped their expectations. Here, in contrast, the structure remained steady. The heated water symbolized that steadiness more clearly than any written regulation. Conversations during evening hours took on a different tone. Instead of questioning whether the system would fail, some began discussing how it was maintained. They speculated about fuel deliveries and maintenance crews beyond the fence. The topic shifted from doubt to understanding. A few men admitted privately that the routine brought relief. Not relief from captivity itself, but from uncertainty. The predictability reduced a constant tension they had grown accustomed to carrying. Knowing what to expect, even in small matters, restored a sense of mental balance. The warmth of the water now blended into larger reflections about American infrastructure. If such facilities were standard even in remote camps, what did that suggest about civilian life outside the wire? The idea unsettled certain narratives they had carried from home. Still, not everyone embraced the comfort easily. A handful maintained distance, limiting their use of the showers and keeping conversations brief. For them, acceptance felt like surrender to unfamiliar conditions. They preferred caution, even when caution no longer seemed necessary. Over time, subtle habits formed. Towels were folded with care. Soap was exchanged politely. The building became quieter, not because fewer men entered, but because the initial tension had dissolved. The atmosphere shifted from curiosity to routine. Outside, winter deepened. Snow gathered along the perimeter, softening the harsh lines of the fencing. Work continued in cold air that cut across open fields. Returning to the heated facility after those hours outside created a contrast that few ignored. The warmth did more than ease physical discomfort. It created a boundary between labor and rest, between exposure and shelter. That boundary gave structure to the day. It reminded them that even within confinement, there were defined transitions. Some began to draw comparisons with their lives before the war. Indoor plumbing had existed, of course, but not always with this level of regular access. Here, even under guard, the system functioned without visible strain. It was not improvised, it was built to last. Gradually, the heated water stopped being a subject of debate. Instead, it became an unspoken expectation. When a valve turned, the warmth followed. When the steam rose, it did so without hesitation. Reliability replaced surprise. Yet the psychological effect remained. The realization that comfort could coexist with captivity introduced complexity into their thinking. It challenged simple assumptions about enemies and environments. It forced a reconsideration of what strength and organization looked like. By the end of the month, the facility stood as a quiet symbol of something larger. Not kindness, not generosity, but system. It represented planning, resources, and an approach to daily life that prioritized function and stability. The men did not speak about these reflections openly very often. Pride and habit discouraged such admissions. But in the steady rhythm of their movements, turning valves without pause, stepping into warmth without suspicion, the shift was visible. The building no longer felt like a surprise. It felt like part of the structure that defined their days. And in that steady pattern, another assumption quietly faded, replaced by a more complicated understanding of the place in which they now lived. By the fourth month of winter, the heated barracks had ceased to feel like a contradiction and had instead become one of the quiet pillars of daily routine, shaping how the men measured comfort within confinement. What once triggered guarded glances now required no explanation at all. Jackets were removed without hesitation, boots set neatly beneath benches, and the turn of a valve produced warmth with the same reliability as sunrise. The predictability of the heat began influencing how they approached colder tasks outside. Work details still demanded endurance, and the wind across open ground remained sharp and unforgiving. Yet the knowledge that a warm interior awaited at the end of the shift subtly altered their posture. Endurance no longer felt like exposure without relief. It felt like a segment within a larger, structured day. Some prisoners began noticing how the contrast between outdoor cold and indoor warmth emphasized the efficiency of the system. The heating was not erratic or improvised. It was stable. Pipes did not rattle excessively. Valves did not stick. The building maintained its function without visible strain. Stability, once observed repeatedly, begins to reshape expectation. A few of the men with technical backgrounds studied the infrastructure more closely, tracing the path of the pipes and considering how fuel must be supplied and regulated. Their discussions became less speculative and more analytical. They spoke about insulation, boiler capacity, and distribution, treating the facility almost as a case study rather than a surprise. That analytical shift revealed something important. The focus had moved away from disbelief toward understanding. Disbelief thrives in unfamiliarity, while understanding grows through repetition. By now, repetition had erased the sense of novelty. Conversations during evening hours began, including subtle reflections on the broader implications of such infrastructure. If this level of heating existed in a remote camp, what did that suggest about towns and cities beyond the fence? The thought lingered quietly, not as admiration, but as recognition of organization. Even those who initially resisted using the facility now participated without visible reluctance. The act had lost its emotional weight and settled into habit. Habit is powerful in confinement because it stabilizes days that might otherwise blur together. Outside, snow continued to gather in drifts against the perimeter. Frost formed patterns along the wire in early morning light. The contrast between that frozen landscape and the steady warmth inside reinforced the difference between exposure and shelter. The heated space became a boundary marker within the daily rhythm. There were no speeches about it, no dramatic acknowledgments. Instead, acceptance appeared in small gestures, quicker transitions between tasks, quieter exchanges while steam rose, less tension in shoulders once inside. These details signaled that the system had been integrated into their expectations. Importantly, The warmth did not soften their awareness of captivity. The fences remained, the guards remained, and the structure of the camp did not change. Yet the coexistence of restriction and regulated comfort created a more layered understanding of their situation. The heated barracks symbolized order. Not kindness, not indulgence, but order. Order can feel disorienting when it replaces chaos, especially for those who had prepared mentally for relentless hardship. Here, order defined daily life. As winter deepened, the building's steady function served as quiet evidence that not all assumptions would hold under close observation. Systems can operate efficiently even within conflict. Infrastructure can persist even during war. By the end of the season, the heated facility was no longer a topic of conversation. It was an expectation fulfilled each day. And in that fulfillment, a subtle transformation had occurred. The men no longer questioned whether the warmth would continue. They assumed it would. That assumption marked a shift from suspicion to routine. What once felt like a trick now felt structural. And in that shift, their understanding of their environment grew more complex, shaped not by dramatic events, but by the steady hum of pipes carrying warmth through wooden walls. By the final stretch of winter, the heated barracks had become so embedded in daily life that few of the men consciously thought about it anymore. Yet its influence lingered in ways that were not immediately obvious. What once felt like a contradiction had transformed into a baseline expectation. The door would close, the air would warm, and the routine would continue without interruption. This predictability altered more than comfort. It shaped how they organized their mental energy. When warmth is reliable, attention shifts elsewhere. Instead of bracing constantly against cold, the mind begins focusing on work tasks, correspondence, or the next scheduled activity. Stability in one area frees attention in another. Several of the men noticed that the steady indoor heat reduced small tensions that had accumulated during colder months. Shoulders relaxed more quickly once inside. Hands regained feeling without prolonged effort. These physical adjustments, though minor, influenced mood and endurance over time. The building itself remained simple. There were no elaborate decorations or excess features. It was functional, clean, and maintained. Yet that functionality carried significance. In an environment defined by rules and boundaries, reliability communicated structure. Conversations about the heating system gradually faded. It no longer inspired speculation or analysis. The novelty had dissolved into habit. Habit, when repeated long enough, becomes invisible, even if it once felt remarkable. Still, the contrast between expectation and reality lingered in memory. Many had imagined crude shelters and irregular conditions when they first arrived. Instead, they encountered a system that maintained indoor warmth consistently. That discovery reshaped assumptions quietly, without ceremony. Even as snow began to melt and winter loosened its grip, the psychological shift remained. The men had learned that not every hardship they anticipated would materialize in the form they expected. Some elements of captivity were severe and unyielding. Others were structured and regulated with surprising efficiency. The warmth inside the barracks became a symbol of that complexity. It did not negate the fences or the limitations placed upon them. It did not suggest freedom. Yet it demonstrated that the environment was governed by systems designed to function steadily rather than chaotically. For a few of the older prisoners, the steady heat evoked comparisons with certain parts of civilian life they remembered from before the war. Organized infrastructure, consistent utilities, and dependable services had once been taken for granted. Here, under guard, they reappeared in unexpected form. By the end of the season, the men no longer viewed the warmth as an anomaly. It was simply part of the pattern that defined their days. The pipes hummed, the valves turned, and steam rose without interruption. Outside, conditions shifted with weather and time. Inside, the system held firm. This quiet reliability reinforced a broader realization. Their captivity existed within a framework built on order. That order governed meals, schedules, inspections, and even temperature. Recognizing this did not erase hardship, but it clarified it. The heated barracks had begun as a shock, something that unsettled expectations. It ended as routine, something folded into memory alongside other daily structures. And in that transformation, from suspicion to assumption, the men adjusted not only to warmth, but to a more complex understanding of the place in which they now lived. In the end, the heated barracks did not change their status, did not remove the fences, and did not shorten the war. Yet the steady warmth inside those wooden walls forced a quiet reconsideration of what captivity would mean in this distant place. What had begun as suspicion slowly settled into routine, and routine reshaped expectation more effectively than any explanation could have. The men had prepared themselves mentally for relentless cold and deprivation, believing that endurance would require constant resistance to discomfort. Instead, they encountered a system that functioned with consistency, where heat flowed through pipes at scheduled hours and returned each day without negotiation. That consistency did not signal leniency, it signaled structure. Over time, the warmth became less about physical relief and more about predictability. Predictability steadies the mind, especially in environments defined by limitation. When certain elements remain stable, attention can shift toward other concerns, and mental energy is no longer consumed entirely by uncertainty. The contrast between frozen ground outside and regulated heat inside remained visible through the seasons, reminding them that hardship and organization could coexist. The fences still marked boundaries, and the guards still enforced rules. Yet within those boundaries, infrastructure operated with quiet reliability. Years later, when memories of captivity were recalled, it would not only be the cold wind or the work details that stood out, but also the unexpected steadiness of indoor warmth, the hum of pipes overhead, and the simple act of turning a valve without hesitation. Small routines often leave lasting impressions because they define how long periods were lived, not just how they began. And so this story settles not as a tale of comfort, but as a reflection on structure. The heated barracks symbolized a broader system built on order and maintenance, challenging assumptions without dramatic gestures. Within confinement, warmth flowed steadily, and in that steady flow, disbelief gave way to understanding, reshaping how the men perceived the world on the other side of the wire. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.